What if the road you are driving on doesn't lead to the next town, but straight out of existence? What if the headlights tracking you in your rearview mirror belong to a car that crashed 40 years ago? What if the radio station playing in your dashboard begins broadcasting the exact thoughts inside your head? The worn tires of the old sedan crunched heavily against the gravel shoulder of Route 9. A desolate stretch of cracked asphalt carving through the dark heart of the dense Maine wilderness. Marcus Vance checked the glowing green digital clock on his dashboard. It was exactly midnight. At 26, Marcus was a night shift logistics coordinator for a commercial shipping firm, well accustomed to lonely midnight drives, but tonight felt distinctly different. He had been driving for nearly 3 hours without passing a single gas station, highway sign, or oncoming vehicle. The air inside the car had grown thick and suffocatingly cold, carrying a strange metallic scent that smelled uncomfortably like wet copper and old earth. Outside, a thick mountain fog had rolled off the pines, swallowing the headlights and turning the surrounding forest into an impenetrable wall of jagged black silhouettes. Marcus shivered, turning the heater knob to maximum. But the vents only blasted a gust of freezing air that turned his rapid breathing into thick white plumes of frost. Everything had started normally when he left the depot at 9 p.m. The highway was empty, the radio was playing a soft jazz station, and the engine hummed with a familiar, comforting rhythm. But as he crossed the county line into the deep woods, the infrastructure of the modern world began to rapidly disintegrate. First, the cellular bars on his phone dropped to a flat, dead zero, the screen flashing an erratic no-service warning before the screen froze entirely on a distorted image of his lock screen. Then, the car's radio began to warp, the music cutting out into a violent burst of static that made Marcus jump in his seat. The digital display on the dashboard began to flicker, the numbers spinning wildly backward and forward before draining to total darkness. The car's headlights dimmed to a dull yellow amber, barely cutting through the dense, heavy fog that seemed to press directly against the windshield like a physical weight. Marcus tapped the dashboard out of frustration, trying to coax life back into the electronics, but his focus was instantly shattered by something ahead. The highway abruptly ended. The asphalt simply dissolved into a vast, sprawling expanse of overgrown, ruined dirt tracks that led toward a dark, hollowed-out clearing in the trees. Marcus slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a violent halt just inches away from a rotting wooden sign buried in the tall grass. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pulled a heavy steel flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the freezing night air. He shined the bright white beam at the weathered wood of the sign. Carved into its surface in crude, jagged letters was a name: Oakhaven Settlement. Marcus felt his stomach drop. As a lifelong resident of the state, he knew the history of the region perfectly. Oakhaven was a vanished lumber colony that had completely disappeared from the state records in the winter of 1906. Over 100 settlers had walked into the woods one night and were never seen again, their homes left perfectly intact. Driven by a paralyzing mix of survival instinct and absolute disbelief, Marcus walked a few steps into the clearing. His boots sank into the damp, frozen soil. The flashlight beam swept across a row of crumbling black timber cabins, their roofs caved in by a century of heavy snow, their windows gaping like hollow eye sockets. He pulled out his dead phone, hoping for a miracle, but the glass screen was warm to the touch, and the dead battery icon flashed a bright, mocking red before the device died completely. He was entirely cut off, standing in a geographic dead zone that didn't exist on any map. A sudden, sharp snapping sound echoed from the dark interior of the largest cabin on the left. Marcus spun around, his flashlight beam trembling so violently that the shadows of the pine trees seemed to twist and contort across the ground. The heavy wooden door of the cabin groaned on rusted iron hinges, swinging wide open into the pitch-black void inside. "Is someone there?" "I'm stranded. My car died," Marcus called out, his voice shaking as he took a defensive step backward toward his sedan. A figure emerged slowly from the darkness of the doorway, stepping into the weak light of the clearing. It was a man wearing a tattered, filth-encrusted heavy winter coat and a wide-brimmed felt hat, his face cast in deep shadow. But it wasn't the archaic clothing that made Marcus's heart hammer against his ribs. It was the grotesque mechanics of the figure's movement, The man did not walk with a human gait. He moved with a jerky, erratic rigidity, his legs snapping forward with loud, wet popping sounds, like fractured bones forcing their way through muscle. It looked as if he were a heavy carcass being violently manipulated from above by thick, invisible ropes. "The logbooks are empty, Marcus. We need another name to close the ledger." A voice vibrated through the freezing air. It didn't belong to a single person. It was a terrifying, layered chorus of dozens of overlapping voices, gruff woodsmen, trembling women, and weeping children, all speaking in a flat, monotone unison that bounced off the interior walls of Marcus's skull. Marcus stumbled backward, his heel catching on a protruding tree root as he struggled to keep his balance. "How do you know my name? What is this place? I'm leaving." The entity stopped moving, standing perfectly still 10 feet away. Then, with a sickening metallic crunch, its head snapped backward at an impossible, broken 90-degree angle. As the flashlight beam illuminated the entity's face, Marcus let out a choked gasp of horror. The figure had no eyes, no nose, no lips. It was a smooth, feature-stripped mask of pale, bloodless flesh stretched tightly over bone. But beneath the wet surface of the skin, something was violently alive. Thick, subterranean shapes were writhing and tunneling under the flesh, aggressively punching outward from the inside, desperately trying to force the blank skin into a human shape. "You've been driving in circles for hours, Marcus," the chorus of voices whispered, sounding as if they were standing directly behind his shoulders, though the physical body remained entirely stationary across the dirt path. The entity's blank face began to violently boil and warp. The skin rippled like liquid, bubbling up and molding itself into a horrific, pixel-perfect copy of a face Marcus knew intimately. Within seconds, the shifting flesh settled into the exact features, the exact jawline, and the exact dark eyes of Marcus's older brother, a highway patrolman who had gone missing on these very roads 3 years ago. The entity smiled, the jaw unhinging far past human limits to reveal a cavernous throat lined with dozens of small, needle-sharp teeth. It spoke again, using his brother's precise, deep baritone voice, though it was hollowed out by a cold, predatory hunger. "Give me the keys, Mark. I'll drive us home. It's so cold out here in the woods." Absolute psychological panic shattered Marcus's mind. This wasn't a phantom or a standard ghost. It was an ancient supernatural entity, a shape-shifting predator that had digested the lost town of Oakhaven and his own brother, using their collective memories, voices, and faces as a net to trap fresh prey. It was mining the deepest trauma of his mind to paralyze his will to fight. Suddenly, hundreds of dark, rhythmic whispers began to bleed directly out of the rotting log cabins and the black earth beneath his feet. "Fill the ledger. Stop the car. Stay in the woods." The deep shadows cast by the trees began to detach themselves from the bark, sliding across the damp grass like spilled black ink, all slithering toward him. As they entered the light of his flashlight, Marcus saw them morphing, taking on the grotesque, half-formed silhouettes of children in old winter coats and men holding rusted axes, all stretching out elongated bone-white arms toward him. The concept of time completely dissolved. Marcus's dashboard clock, visible through the open car door, began to spin backward into the 19th century. Minutes felt like agonizing hours, as he turned on his heel and fled in pure terror back toward his car. Behind him, the entity wearing his brother's face dropped onto all fours, its joints snapping backward with deafening cracks as it pursued him with a rapid, insect-like skittering sound across the dirt. Marcus threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it just as a heavy, wet, massive force slammed violently against the driver's side window. The glass webbed with thousands of fractures under the immense impact. The metal door denting inward as a chorus of 100 dead voices screamed his name through the cracking glass. Without looking, Marcus slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning violently in the loose gravel as he floored the gas pedal. The sedan tore backward down the dark path, smashing through overgrown brush and low-hanging branches until the tires finally caught the hard asphalt of Route 9. He shifted into drive, the engine roaring in protest as he flew down the winding highway at breakneck speed, completely refusing to look at his rearview mirror where two pale headlights were tracking him from the fog. He drove through the blinding mist for what felt like days, pushed entirely by raw survival adrenaline, until the dark walls of the Maine forest finally broke, revealing the streetlights of his suburban neighborhood. The sun was just beginning to crack the horizon, casting a cold gray light over the paved driveways, when Marcus finally pulled up outside his small, single-story home. He was hyperventilating, his hands cut from the shattered glass of his window, his body shivering from profound exhaustion. He bolted inside, slamming the heavy wooden front door and locking every single security latch, chain, and deadbolt he owned. He collapsed against the door, sliding down to the floor as tears of relief finally spilled over his cheeks. He forced himself to rationalize the nightmare. It was a sleep deprivation hallucination. He had been working 80 hours a week. The carbon monoxide from the car's exhaust must have leaked into the cabin, causing a vivid, waking, psychotic break. It had to be. He was back in his house. The forest was miles away. He was safe. An hour passed in absolute agonizing silence as the morning light filled the living room. Marcus's breathing finally stabilized, the familiar warmth of his home calming his shattered nerves. Then, a soft, deliberate metallic scrape echoed from the front door, right behind his head. Marcus froze, every single nerve ending in his body setting on fire. He turned his head slowly, watching in absolute horror as the metal mail slot on the bottom of his door slowly pushed open from the outside. There were no footsteps on his porch, no cars in the driveway. A small, heavy object slid through the narrow slot, landing on the hardwood floor with a loud, distinct metallic thud. A pristine piece of folded white cardstock followed it, sliding smoothly across the floorboards. His heart stopping in his chest, Marcus crawled toward the object on his hands and knees. Lying on the floor was an old, rusted car key, the exact duplicate key to his brother's missing patrol car. With a hand that shook so violently he could barely grip it, Marcus picked up the folded white cardstock and opened it. Written across the inside in a precise, elegant, and chillingly familiar handwriting, his own handwriting, was a single line of text. The highway loop is finished. Your house is now part of the woods. Look out your window, Marcus.